Hey everyone, and welcome to this video in which I'll be analyzing some of the writing techniques implemented by Vladimir Nabokov in his novel, Lolita. Now, this book was recommended to me by one of my subscribers a while back, and while I agree that it is very skillfully written, I have some very serious objections regarding its subject matter. If you've ever read or heard anything about this horror story, which Vanity Fair calls the only convincing love story of our century, you'll understand why I was unexpectedly disgusted and disturbed having gone into it blindly, and why I do not intend on finishing it. Still, I thought I would analyze some of the techniques responsible for the intellectual sophistication of Nabokov's prose, because in this case, I think there is value to be found in separating the content of the story from the skill with which it was clearly written. But don't worry, I was able to select excerpts from the novel that don't include any of the inappropriate material. On this channel, I've often discussed the importance of making your writing concise and when best to end a given sentence, but it's also important to understand how to draw out or extend a given sentence, whether for reasons of conveying a character's rambling, erratic personality, or simply because you feel that it's necessary to include a large amount of information without interrupting the flow with a period. And in my limited experience, having also read a little Dostoevsky, no one can write long, complex sentences quite like the Russians. Let me know in the comments if you agree. So without further ado, let's dive into our first of 3 examples, all of which exemplify different ways of packing large amounts of information into a single sentence. And keep an eye on Nabokov's evocative word choices too. I won't delve too deeply into this aspect of his prose, but it's definitely something worth noting. It occurred to me that regular hours, home-cooked meals, all the conventions of marriage, the prophylactic routine of its bedroom activities, and who knows, the eventual flowering of certain moral values, of certain spiritual substitutes, might help me, if not to purge myself of my degrading and dangerous desires, at least to keep them under pacific control. What I want to draw your attention to here is how Nabokov includes many of what I like to call asides in this sentence, and by aside I'm referring to the insertion of pieces of information that, while being relevant to the focus of the sentence, deviate from the primary direction in which the sentence is going. See what I did there? To better explain what I mean, allow me to read a version of this sentence with all these brief tangents removed. It occurred to me that regular hours, home-cooked meals, all the conventions of marriage, and the prophylactic routine of its bedroom activities might help me keep my degrading and dangerous desires under pacific control. Notice how this version maintains a constant direction all the way through, while in the original, the reader is led down a more meandering path, both here, where Nabokov writes, who knows, the eventual flowering of certain moral values, of certain spiritual substitutes, and here, when he writes, if not to purge myself of my degrading and dangerous desires, at least to, etc. If you do this too much, your prose will sound bumpy and jarring, and your reader may get lost halfway through a sentence, but if you succeed in maintaining the flow, this technique can lend a certain intellectual sophistication to your prose, if that's what you're going for. Before I move on to the second writing technique, allow me to read a bonus excerpt that further exemplifies Nabokov's use of asides to insert physical descriptions into a sentence that is primarily focused on describing a sequence of otherwise mundane actions. Next day, an asthmatic woman, coarsely painted, garrulous, garlicky, with an almost farcical provincial accent and a black mustache above a purple lip, took me to what was apparently her own domicile, and there, after explosively kissing the bunched tips of her fat fingers to signify the delectable rosebud quality of her merchandise, she theatrically drew aside a curtain to reveal what I judged was that part of the room where a large and unfastidious family usually slept. I won't delve too deeply into this one, but I just wanted to highlight here and here, where Nabokov deviates from the main focus of the sentence and goes off on descriptive tangents, because I find inserting physical descriptions of people, places, and things into otherwise bland sentences is a useful technique. Now, let's move on to our second example, which describes the awkwardness that takes place after the main character's wife leaves him for another man, an uncomfortable scene in which all 3 of them are forced to be in each other's company. She by now was preening herself, between him and me, rouging her pursed lips, tripling her chin to pick at her blouse bosom, and so forth, and he spoke of her as if she were absent, and also as if she were a kind of little ward that was in the act of being transferred for her own good, from one wise guardian to another even wiser one, and although my helpless wrath may have exaggerated and disfigured certain impressions, I can swear that he actually consulted me on such things as her diet, her periods, her wardrobe, and the books she had read or should read. In this example, what I want to draw your attention to is how Nabokov switches the subject of the sentence thrice, breaking up the sentence into 3 distinct sections without starting a new one. Here, the focus is on she, the woman who is leaving one man for another, and Nabokov lists a few of the things she's doing. Next, the focus shifts to he, referring to the new man she's in love with, and Nabokov describes the manner in which he spoke. And finally, using a semicolon instead of a period to maintain the contextual flow of the sentence, the focus shifts yet again to the main character, using the pronouns I, me, and my when describing his own interaction with this other man. Whether or not a reader is going to enjoy this sort of style really comes down to their own personal preferences, and as a writer, you should know that successfully constructing these types of fluid, rambling sentences requires a rather high degree of skill. In a previous video I made analyzing the prose of George R.R. Martin, author of A Game of Thrones, I discussed the importance of knowing when to end your sentences and emphasized conciseness. But, as is always the case, every so-called rule of writing has exceptions, and the complex prose of Vladimir Nabokov exemplifies many such exceptions. Allow me to read our third and final example. She was, obviously, one of those women whose polished words may reflect a book club or a bridge club or any other deadly conventionality, but never her soul. Women who are completely devoid of humor. Women utterly indifferent at heart to the dozen or so possible subjects of a parlor conversation, but very particular about the rules of such conversations, through the sunny cellophane of which not very appetizing frustrations can be readily distinguished. If the previous examples weren't evidence enough, I think this last one does a great job at exemplifying the sophisticated and intellectual voice of Vladimir Nabokov. As I said in the introduction, I have some pretty serious objections regarding the subject matter of his novel, Lolita, but there's no denying the skill with which it was written, or Nabokov's insights into human nature. Specifically, I want to draw your attention to how Nabokov uses semicolons to extrapolate on his initial insights into the type of woman he's describing, namely one whose polished words may reflect a book club or bridge club or any other deadly conventionality, but never her soul. Notice how both of the following extrapolations echo the first, both beginning with the word woman to let the reader know his focus has not shifted entirely, but is rather honing in on a different aspect of the same archetype, the first being that such women are completely devoid of humor, and the second being that they are indifferent at heart to the dozen or so possible subjects of a parlor conversation, but very particular about the rules of such conversations. This sort of technique is often implemented when you, the writer, really want to flesh out your description of a given subject, but are worried commas might make the prose too messy, and placing periods might make it too disjointed. In typical Nabokov fashion, he then uses some very evocative word choices, describing her outward appearance as sunny cellophane, through which not very appetizing frustrations can be readily distinguished. Anyway, I hope you found my analysis of Vladimir Nabokov's writing techniques useful. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions, and as always, like and subscribe for more technical writing videos.